city pulsed with gold, art, and the whispered power of its ruling family. A lone friar arrived, a prophet roaring fire and brimstone. He told everyone they were heading straight for doom. This was not a fantasy. This was Florence, 1490s. The friar, Girolamo Savonarola, decided to take on the most powerful family in Italy, the Medici. Their clashes ripped the city apart. What happened next will make your jaw drop. Number 7. The fiery end in the Piazza della Signoria. The morning of May 23rd, 1498, dawned gray over Florence. A scaffold stood tall in the Piazza della Signoria, looming over the same spot where centuries of civic life had unfolded. This was no ordinary scaffold. It was built like a grim stage. A pyre of wood was at its base, waiting for a spark. Above it, a gallows stood ready. The air was thick with tension, not the joyful noise of a festival, but a hushed, expectant dread. Thousands of eyes fixed on the grim structure. The citizens lined the square, pressed against each other, their faces a mix of curiosity, fear, and sorrow. Some had been his fiercest supporters, now they watched in silence. Others had been his bitterest enemies, and a grim satisfaction settled on their features. And Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar, who had ruled Florentine hearts and minds for years, was led out of the Palazzo della Signoria. He was no longer the thundering orator, the fiery prophet whose voice could shake the very foundations of the city. He wore a simple habit. His face was pale, his eyes tired, but still held a trace of defiance. Beside him walked two of his closest followers, Fra Domenico de Pescia and Fra Silvestro Maruffi, their own spirits tested by weeks of imprisonment and torture. Records from the city archives describe their slow, somber procession. The first step of the execution was a stripping away. Savonarola and his companions were brought before the Bishop of Volterra, a man named Benedetto Pagagnati. The bishop, acting on behalf of papal authority, began the ceremony of degradation. He took away their clerical vestments one by one. Each garment represented a holy office, a spiritual power. As each piece of cloth was removed, the bishop recited the words of excommunication. "I separate thee from the church militant and the church triumphant." Savonarola, according to eyewitness accounts, corrected him. At this point, his voice, though weakened, still carried authority. "From the church militant, you may separate me," he declared, "but from the church triumphant, you cannot." This was his final, unwavering assertion of his spiritual standing, a claim to a higher judgment. After the stripping, the three friars were handed over to the secular authorities. This signaled the church's wash of its hands. The Florentine Signoria, the city government, was now in charge of the final, terrible act. The Gonfaloniere di Giustizia, the head of the Signoria, gave the final order. The friars were led to the gallows. A ladder awaited them, stretching up to the crossbeam. They ascended one by one. Fra Silvestro went first, his steps faltering. Fra Domenico followed, his face showing a grim resolve. Then it was Savonarola's turn. The ropes were placed around their necks. A hush fell over the piazza, broken only by the distant sounds of the city. The executioner, a man named Giacomo Rondinelli, carried out his grim duty. The bodies swung in the morning air. A gasp rose from the crowd, a collective exhalation. The life drained from the men who had preached such fervent messages to Florence, but the spectacle was not over. The method of execution was designed to be doubly punishing, a final insult to their teachings. After their deaths by hanging, the bodies were lowered. They were then secured to the posts above the waiting pyre. Fire was applied. The flames leaped up, consuming the wood, then the bodies. The smoke billowed, carrying the scent of burning flesh across the piazza. The crowd watched as the figures, once vibrant with life and belief, turned to ash. This was a deliberate act, a way to prevent any relics from being collected by Savonarola's still loyal followers. The Signoria wanted to eradicate any trace of his physical presence, to prevent a cult of martyrdom. The execution was a victory for Savonarola's opponents within Florence and for the papacy in Rome. Among those who surely received the news with satisfaction were the Medici family. Though exiled, Giovanni de' Medici, now Cardinal, had tirelessly worked to undermine Savonarola's power. He saw the friar as the primary obstacle to the family's return to Florence. The fall of Savonarola opened a path for the Medici to reclaim their old dominance. The friar's death cleared the way for future political maneuvering and a return to the old order in Florence, an order Savonarola had fought so hard to dismantle. The ashes of Savonarola and his companions were gathered up and, under strict guard, cast into the Arno River. The river, which had flowed through Florence for centuries, now carried away the last physical remnants of the man who had dared to challenge princes, popes, and the very spirit of his age. The piazza emptied slowly. A chapter in Florentine history had closed, violently and irrevocably. Number 6, the Great Bonfire of the Vanities. The year 1497 opened with a chill both in the Florentine air and in the political climate. Savonarola's influence was still immense, but cracks were forming in his formidable power. The city was preparing for Carnival, a time usually marked by wild abandon, masquerades, and boisterous celebrations. But under Savonarola's sway, Carnival in Florence had transformed into something else entirely. It was no longer a time of revelry, but a season of spiritual cleansing. On February 7, 1497, Florence witnessed an event that would echo through history, the Bonfire of the Vanities. This was not a spontaneous outburst of religious fervor. It was a meticulously organized event, orchestrated by Savonarola and his devoted followers, especially the bands of young boys he had organized into a kind of moral police force. These children of the fanciulli, dressed in white robes, had been sent door to door for weeks before, collecting objects deemed sinful or worldly. Their earnest faces and high-pitched voices delivered stern warnings to adults, a shocking reversal of traditional roles. The collected items were brought to the Piazza della Signoria, piling up into a massive pyramid, reaching higher than any man. Historians describe a towering structure, some 60 feet tall, filled with a staggering variety of forbidden treasures. What went into this colossal pyre? The list was long and shocking to many Florentines who cherished their artistic and cultural life. Fancy dresses, wigs, cosmetics, mirrors, and opulent jewelry were thrown onto the pile. Cards and dice, instruments of gambling were added. Musical instruments, especially lutes and flutes, were deemed instruments of frivolous pleasure. Books of secular poetry, classical texts, and even some works by the great humanist scholars like Boccaccio were added. Paintings and sculptures considered lewd or idolatrous, particularly mythological scenes, found their way onto the heap. One anecdote, widely circulated, tells of a merchant from Venice who offered 22,000 gold florins to buy the entire collection and save it from the flames. The children, however, refused him, declaring the items sacred to the bonfire. The atmosphere in the piazza was electric. Thousands gathered to watch, a mix of zealous supporters, curious onlookers, and horrified opponents. The children of the fanciulli sang hymns, their voices ringing out over the square. Dominican friars moved among the crowd, their expressions solemn. The flames were lit. The pyre ignited with a roar, sending plumes of black smoke into the crisp winter sky. The heat radiated across the piazza. The crackling sounds of burning wood mingled with the cheers of the faithful and the murmurs of the less convinced. Precious works of art, carefully crafted objects, and symbols of the Renaissance's love for beauty and human achievement turned to ash. The Bonfire of the Vanities was a bold statement. It was Savonarola's most visible and dramatic attempt to purify Florence, to make it truly a Republic of Christ, a city dedicated entirely to God's will. He believed that such a radical cleansing was necessary to avert divine wrath and to secure Florence's spiritual destiny. He genuinely saw this act as a necessary step toward salvation for the city. However, the bonfire also served to deepen the divisions within Florence and to provoke further anger from powerful outside forces, especially the Pope. Pope Alexander VI, a man whose personal life was a stark contrast to Savonarola's asceticism, viewed the friar with increasing alarm. The bonfire of the vanities, destroying objects that symbolized the very culture of the Renaissance papacy, was seen as an insult. The Pope had already summoned Savonarola to Rome, a summons Savonarola had defied. He had also sent a formal papal letter offering Savonarola a cardinal's hat if he would temper his sermons. Savonarola famously rejected this, declaring he would only accept a red hat of martyrdom. The bonfire of the Vanities also alienated many powerful Florentine families, particularly those who profited from the very industries Savonarola attacked, such as luxury goods, banking, and art. These families included the Companacci, or Wicked Companions, a group of young aristocrats who chafed under Savonarola's puritanical rule. Many of them had strong ties to the exiled Medici family. They were the ones who yearned for the return of the lavish Medici court, the vibrant intellectual life, and the commercial prosperity that Savonarola's austerity threatened. They saw the bonfire as an act of vandalism, a destruction of their heritage and their way of life. The event intensified the Pope's determination to silence Savonarola. It provided more fuel for the arguments of Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici and other Medici loyalists who constantly pressed the Pope to act. They argued that Savonarola was a dangerous heretic, a schismatic who undermined papal authority and threatened the stability of Italy. The bonfire was just another piece of evidence in their growing case. The flames that consumed the vanities in the piazza also consumed some of the goodwill Savonarola still had, pushing Florence closer to a breaking point. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown. Number 5. The Pope's Wrath and Medici Machinations. The year 1495 unfolded with a growing sense of peril for Girolamo Savonarola. His hold on Florence was strong, but forces beyond the city walls were gathering against him. Chief among these was Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, a man known for his political acumen and fierce protection of papal authority. The Pope saw Savonarola not just as a nuisance, but as a direct challenge to his power and the established order of the Church. The Medici family, especially the exiled Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, saw the Pope's growing anger as their golden opportunity. Pope Alexander VI had initially adopted a cautious approach to Savonarola. He heard reports of the friar's fiery sermons and his influence in Florence. At first, he might have seen Savonarola as a reformer, albeit an extreme one. However, as Savonarola's sermons grew more defiant, as he openly criticized the corruption of the Church and even the Pope's personal life, Alexander VI's patience wore thin. The Pope's concern was not just about theological correctness, it was deeply political. Savonarola's new Florentine Republic, which refused to join the Holy League against France, was a direct affront to papal foreign policy. The Pope feared a schism, a division within the Church, if Savonarola continued unchecked. The Pope sent repeated warnings and summons for Savonarola to come to Rome. Savonarola, citing ill health and threats to his life, refused to go. He stated he had a divine mission in Florence, a mission that could not be abandoned. This defiance infuriated Alexander VI. In July 1495, the Pope issued a papal brief, a formal letter, ordering Savonarola to cease preaching. He cited the friar's disobedience and hinted at future penalties. Savonarola, ever the master of public relations, temporarily obeyed, but only to resume preaching months later, his sermons even more fervent than before. The Medici family, particularly Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, played a significant role in fanning the flames of papal anger. From his exile in Rome, Giovanni de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent's son, worked tirelessly to undermine Savonarola. He knew that as long as Savonarola commanded the loyalty of Florence, the Medici could not return. Giovanni maintained close ties with the papal court, using his position as a cardinal to press the case against the friar. He painted Savonarola as a dangerous fanatic, a heretic, and a threat to both secular and ecclesiastical order. He reminded the Pope of Savonarola's criticisms of papal corruption, his radical republicanism, and his disregard for Rome's authority. Giovanni de' Medici found eager allies among the Florentine exiles who had fled when the Medici were expelled. These exiles were a powerful lobbying group, pouring their grievances and complaints into the Pope's ears. They longed for the stability and patronage that Medici rule had provided, and they saw Savonarola as the radical force that had upended their world. They fed the Pope stories of Savonarola's increasingly strict regime, the bonfires of the vanities, and the friars' control over the city's political life. The Pope, under constant pressure from both within Florence and from the Medici exiles, grew more decisive. On May 12, 1497, Pope Alexander VI issued a formal bull of excommunication against Savonarola. This was a devastating blow. Excommunication meant Savonarola was cut off from the church, denied the sacraments, and considered a heretic. It was a spiritual death sentence, a tool meant to inspire fear and obedience. The bull stated that Savonarola had ignored all warnings, refused to travel to Rome, and spread dangerous doctrines. The Pope even mentioned Savonarola's alleged visions and prophecies as evidence of his dangerous delusions. News of the excommunication hit Florence like a thunderbolt. For many devout Florentines, excommunication was a terrifying prospect. It meant eternal damnation. Savonarola, however, did not crumble. He spent months debating with his followers and preparing his response. He asserted that the excommunication was invalid, that it was issued by a corrupt pope motivated by personal vendettas and political pressure, not by divine will. He continued to say Mass, to preach, and to lead processions defying the Pope's decree. He produced a document, the Epistle Against the Excommunication, in which he argued forcefully against its legitimacy. This defiance deepened the crisis. Florence was now caught between its allegiance to the friar and its loyalty to the Pope. The Signoria, the city government, found itself in an impossible position. They were under immense pressure from Rome to enforce the excommunication and silence Savonarola. Failure to do so could lead to an interdict, a papal ban on all religious services in Florence, which would devastate the city's spiritual and economic life. It would also further isolate Florence politically in Italy. The Medici, from their vantage point, observed the escalating tension with keen interest. Every step Savonarola took to defy the Pope further weakened his position and brought the Medici closer to their goal. They understood that the more isolated Florence became, the more likely it was that the city would eventually turn against the friar, creating the perfect conditions for their return. The Pope's wrath, fueled by Medici machinations, tightened the noose around Savonarola's neck. The friar was living on borrowed time. Number 4. The Republic of Christ and Medici resistance. With Piero de' Medici's disastrous exit and the French king Charles VIII's brief occupation of Florence, the city was left in a political vacuum. Savonarola stepped into this void, not as a political leader in the conventional sense, but as a moral guide. He seized the moment, offering the Florentines a vision for a truly godly state, a Republic of Christ. This was not just a religious concept, it was a radical political blueprint that fundamentally challenged the Medici's vision for Florence and sparked immediate resistance from the exiled family. Savonarola's sermons after the Medici expulsion grew even more powerful. He preached that Florence's recent misfortunes were divine punishment for its sins, particularly the worldly excesses and tyrannical rule of the Medici. He declared that God himself intended Florence to be a sacred city, a beacon of piety and justice. He presented himself as God's chosen instrument to guide this transformation. His message resonated deeply with many citizens who were weary of political instability, moral decay, and the perceived abuses of Medici power. Under Savonarola's spiritual influence, Florence began to restructure its government. The traditional Medici-dominated system, characterized by a small circle of powerful men controlling the levers of power, was dismantled. The Savonarola advocated for a broader, more representative government. The Great Council, a legislative body open to thousands of citizens, was re-established and given significant power. This was a major shift, transforming Florence from a de facto principality under the Medici into a more democratic republic, at least in theory. The Great Council was designed to be the supreme authority, passing laws and electing magistrates. This move thrilled many ordinary citizens who had felt excluded from Medici rule. Beyond political reforms, Savonarola's vision permeated every aspect of Florentine life. Sumptuary laws were enacted, attempting to curb luxury and ostentatious displays of wealth. Gambling was outlawed, prostitution was suppressed, taverns were monitored. The streets, once lively with carnival revelry, became scenes of religious processions. The very culture of the city shifted dramatically. Savonarola's followers, known as the Piagnoni, or Weepers, for their fervent piety, became the dominant faction. They embraced simplicity, piety, and devotion, shunning the humanistic excesses that had characterized the Medici era. The Savonarola's strict moral code was enforced, sometimes by his young boys, the fanciulli, who acted as vigilantes, urging adults to adhere to the friar's teachings. The Medici family, particularly the exiled Piero de' Medici and his younger brother, Cardinal Giovanni, watched these developments from afar with a mixture of disbelief and fury. They saw their ancestral city, the jewel of their power, transforming into something unrecognizable. The Republic of Christ was a direct repudiation of everything the Medici stood for: their patronage of secular art, their sophisticated diplomacy, their subtle political control, and their vision of Florence as a center of humanistic achievement. For the Medici, Savonarola's Florence was a bleak, puritanical nightmare, a place where their family legacy was being systematically erased. Piero de' Medici, ever impatient and impulsive, made an immediate, albeit clumsy, attempt to reclaim Florence in April 1495. Gathering a small force of mercenary soldiers and some Medici loyalists, he marched towards the city gates. He believed that many Florentines, tired of Savonarola's austerity and the instability, would welcome him back. He was wrong. The city, galvanized by Savonarola's warnings of divine judgment and the newly formed republican government, rallied to its defense. The gates remained shut. Piero's attempt was a humiliating failure. He was forced to retreat, further solidifying Savonarola's narrative that Florence was protected by divine providence, and that the Medici were an unwanted, corrupting force. This failed attempt fueled the Medici's strategic shift. They realized a direct military assault was not the answer. Instead, they began a long campaign of political and diplomatic pressure. Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, with his connections in the Roman Curia, began to lobby Pope Alexander VI relentlessly against Savonarola. Painted the friar as a dangerous schismatic, a rebel against papal authority, and a destabilizing force in Italy. The Medici sought to isolate Florence politically, hoping to make its republican experiment unsustainable. They encouraged hostile neighbors such as the Republic of Venice and Duke Ludovico Sforza of Milan to view Florence with suspicion. Within Florence, the Medici still had sympathizers, though they remained largely in hiding. These were the arrabbiati, or enraged ones, noble families who resented Savonarola's moralizing and longed for the return of the old order. They secretly communicated with the exiled Medici, plotting ways to undermine the friar's influence and prepare for a Medici restoration. They saw the Republic of Christ as an absurdity, a dangerous fantasy that threatened Florence's economic prosperity and international standing. They believed Florence needed strong, worldly leaders like the Medici, not a fanatical friar. The establishment of the Republic of Christ thus marked a profound ideological and political clash. It was not just about who ruled Florence, but about what Florence should be. Savonarola envisioned a holy city, a spiritual powerhouse. The Medici sought to restore a secular state, a cultural and economic leader. Their struggle was not merely for power, but for the very soul of Florence. The Medici knew they could not rest until Savonarola was gone, and their vision could be reimposed. Number 3, Piero's folly and the French invasion. The year 1494 was a whirlwind for Florence, and it was a year that saw the dramatic collapse of Medici power, largely due to the incompetence of Lorenzo the Magnificent's son, Piero de' Medici, and the unforeseen arrival of a foreign king. It was also the year that truly opened the door for Girolamo Savonarola to step from the pulpit into the role of Florence's de facto spiritual and political leader. Piero de' Medici, who had inherited the mantle of his father in 1492, was simply not Lorenzo. He lacked his father's diplomatic skill, his keen political mind, and his ability to charmingly manage the Florentine populace. Piero was arrogant, rash, and focused more on physical prowess and sporting events than on the subtle art of governance. The records of the time from Florentine chroniclers like Luca Landucci and Niccolo Machiavelli describe a man ill-suited to the monumental task of leading a republic. His rule was marked by poor judgment and a lack of foresight. The catalyst for the Medici's downfall came from outside Italy. King Charles VIII of France, a young and ambitious monarch, decided to press his claim to the Kingdom of Naples. This seemingly distant ambition set in motion a chain of events that would directly impact Florence. Charles VIII assembled a massive army numbering tens of thousands, including formidable Swiss mercenaries and heavy artillery. This was an unprecedented show of military might for the Italian peninsula. He intended to march through Italy to reach Naples. Florence, strategically located on the invasion route, found itself in a precarious position. Traditionally, the Medici had cultivated an alliance with France. However, Piero, in a catastrophic diplomatic blunder, had shifted Florentine allegiance towards King Ferrante of Naples, France's enemy. This decision, made without consulting the wider Florentine government, enraged Charles VIII. As the French army descended through Italy, sacking towns and demonstrating its terrifying power, fear gripped Florence. And Savonarola, meanwhile, had been preaching for years about impending divine judgment. He had spoken of a coming scourge, a new Cyrus, who would purify Italy and Florence. When news of Charles VIII's formidable army and its unstoppable march reached Florence, many saw it as the fulfillment of Savonarola's prophecies. The friar's reputation soared. He became the voice of divine warning and guidance. His sermons grew more urgent, more apocalyptic. He warned Florence to repent, to cast off its sins, or face utter destruction. Piero de' Medici, panicking as the French army approached, made another terrible decision. Instead of preparing Florence for defense or engaging in careful diplomacy, he chose a desperate, solitary act. He rode out alone to meet Charles VIII at the French camp near Pisa. This mirrored his father's famous diplomatic mission to Naples years earlier, but Piero utterly lacked his father's finesse. He surrendered to Charles VIII's demands without negotiation. He agreed to give up crucial Florentine strongholds, including Pisa and Livorno, to the French, and to provide enormous sums of money. This act of servile capitulation, made entirely on his own authority, shocked and infuriated the Florentine citizens. News of Piero's surrender reached Florence before he did. The city erupted in outrage. The Florentines, proud and independent, felt deeply betrayed. They saw Piero as having humiliated the Republic and given away their territory. When Piero returned to Florence, attempting to enter the Palazzo della Signoria, he found the doors barred. The bells of the city, usually a sign of assembly, rang out in alarm. The streets filled with angry citizens. Piero's own guards defected. He quickly realized the depth of the public's fury and that his rule was over. He and his family, including his younger brother Giovanni, the future Pope Leo X, fled Florence in a desperate flight, making their way to Venice. The expulsion of the Medici left a power vacuum. The city was in chaos. The French army, led by Charles VIII, entered Florence just days later on November 17th, 1494. Their entry was initially triumphant, but quickly devolved into tension as the French king made increasingly exorbitant demands and behaved like a conqueror. Florence faced the very real threat of being sacked. It was in this critical moment that Savonarola emerged as the city's unlikely savior. He boldly confronted Charles VIII. Accounts vary on the exact words exchanged, but all agree that Savonarola, dressed in his simple Dominican habit, spoke with astonishing authority and courage. He warned the king of divine punishment if he harmed Florence. He presented himself as God's messenger, reminding Charles of his holy mission to reform the church, not to pillage cities. Whether it was Savonarola's powerful rhetoric, the king's own superstitions, or simply a strategic decision, Charles VIII eventually agreed to more lenient terms. He departed Florence, leaving the city intact, though heavily burdened by tribute. Savonarola's fearless confrontation with the French king cemented his image as a prophet and a protector of Florence. He had stood up to worldly power and seemingly prevailed. For many Florentines, this was proof of his divine favor. With the Medici gone and the French departed, Savonarola was poised to guide Florence towards a new puritanical future. The stage was now truly set for his radical experiment, the Republic of Christ. The Medici, exiled and humiliated, could only watch seething from afar. Number 2, the prophet and the prince's deathbed. The year 1492 is often remembered for a ship sailing across the Atlantic, but in Florence it marked a turning point of a different kind. It was the year that Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, lay dying. This period saw one of the most intense and mythologized clashes between the worldly prince and the fiery prophet Girolamo Savonarola. The friction between them had been building for years, a clash of two titans representing entirely different visions for Florence and for humanity. Lorenzo de' Medici embodied the Renaissance. He was a patron of the arts, a poet, a shrewd politician, and a lover of life's pleasures. He had brought unprecedented cultural flourishing and political stability to Florence. His court was a center of humanism, beauty, and intellectual debate. Yet, to Savonarola, this very magnificence was a source of sin. Savonarola, a Dominican friar who arrived in Florence in 1490, saw the city's wealth, its art, its very pursuit of earthly beauty as a corrupting force. He preached austerity, repentance, and a return to strict Christian piety. From the pulpit of the San Marco Monastery and later the Duomo, Savonarola's voice thundered. He condemned the rampant luxury, the gambling, the immoral behavior he saw in Florence. He attacked the corruption within the church itself, railing against simony and the worldly lives of its prelates. While he did not initially name Lorenzo directly, his sermons often contained thinly veiled criticisms of the Medici court and its humanistic ideals. He declared that a terrible judgment was coming, a scourge that would cleanse Florence and Italy of their sins. He prophesied a renovation of the church, a radical spiritual rebirth. Lorenzo, ever the pragmatist, initially dismissed Savonarola as just another zealous preacher. He even sent some of his friends, like the poet Angelo Poliziano and the philosopher Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, to try and soften Savonarola's stance. They reportedly found the friar unyielding, as Lorenzo himself, known for his subtle political maneuvering, tried to extend an olive branch. He sent gifts to San Marco, and even attended some of Savonarola's sermons. He seemed to want to bring the friar into his fold, to manage him, as he had managed so many other influential figures in Florence, but Savonarola was incorruptible in this regard. He reportedly refused many of Lorenzo's overtures, stating that he sought only God's favor, not that of princes. The tension escalated in 1491, when Savonarola became prior of San Marco. In his inaugural sermon, he broke tradition by not paying homage to Lorenzo, who was the monastery's major benefactor. This was a clear sign of defiance. Savonarola's sermons grew bolder, his prophecies more explicit. He spoke of tyrants being overthrown, of Florence facing a divine purge. He directly called for reform and for the Medici to give up their secular power, advocating for a republican government based on divine law. Then came the spring of 1492. Lorenzo de' Medici, only 43 years old, fell gravely ill at his villa in Careggi. He was suffering from a chronic illness, likely gout, which had worsened considerably. As his condition deteriorated, his physicians, including Pier Leone, could do little. Faced with his mortality, Lorenzo reportedly sought spiritual comfort. He sent for Savonarola. This moment, whether it happened exactly as the stories suggest or not, became a powerful legend, symbolizing the ultimate confrontation between the secular and the sacred. Accounts of what transpired at Lorenzo's deathbed vary. Some sources suggest that Lorenzo confessed his sins, including his involvement in the Pazzi conspiracy and his financial misdeeds, and asked for Savonarola's blessing. According to Fra Benedetto, a loyal follower of Savonarola, the friar presented Lorenzo with 3 conditions for absolution. First, Lorenzo had to truly repent. Second, he had to restore all ill-gotten gains. Third, he had to restore Florence to its liberty giving up the Medici's de facto tyrannical rule. Lorenzo allegedly agreed to the first two, but balked at the third, turning his face to the wall. Savonarola, unable to grant absolution under these conditions, reportedly left the villa without absolving Lorenzo. Other contemporary accounts, including those of Poliziano, who was present, contradict this dramatic version. Poliziano describes Savonarola comforting Lorenzo, who died peacefully after receiving the sacraments. It is likely that Savonarola was present and offered spiritual counsel, but the precise details of their conversation, especially the three conditions, became a powerful narrative tool for Savonarola's followers. It presented their leader as the ultimate moral authority, fearless even in the face of the most powerful man in Florence, uncompromising in his demands for justice and freedom. Regardless of the exact words spoken, the encounter at Careggi solidified Savonarola's image as a man of profound moral courage and unyielding principle. For the Florentines, it marked a symbolic transfer of authority from the dying prince of the Renaissance to the rising prophet of divine judgment. Lorenzo's death left a vacuum of power, which his son Piero proved utterly incapable of filling. The path was now open for Savonarola to increase his spiritual and later political influence, paving the way for the dramatic events that would follow. The stage was set for the friar to seize the moral high ground and ultimately challenge the very fabric of Medici rule. Number 1. The arrival of the prophet and the city of sin. The year 1490 saw a new figure arrive in Florence, a man who would shatter the city's comfortable existence and challenge its most powerful family. His name was Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar from Ferrara. He was not a striking figure in appearance. Records describe him as lean, with a prominent nose and deeply set, intense eyes. He lacked the oratorical flourishes of many popular preachers of his day. Yet, when he began to speak, his words had the force of a divine hammer. His arrival marked the first simmering clash with Medici power, a clash that began not with armies or decrees, but with a voice echoing from the pulpit. Florence in 1490 was a city at its zenith. Under the de facto rule of Lorenzo de' Medici, known as the Magnificent, it was a glittering jewel of the Renaissance. Art flourished. Botticelli painted his goddesses. Michelangelo began his prodigious career. Scholars debated Plato and Aristotle in elegant gardens. Poets like Poliziano crafted verses of exquisite beauty. Merchants amassed fortunes, and the city's banks stretched their influence across Europe. This was a city of vibrant life, intellect, and worldly pleasures. Lorenzo, though not officially a monarch, governed with a shrewd hand, maintaining a delicate balance of power in Italy and patronizing genius on a grand scale. Savonarola saw a different Florence. He saw a city steeped in sin, corrupted by luxury, vanity, and a pagan revival that placed human achievement above divine worship. He believed the humanist philosophy cherished by the Medici court was leading souls to damnation. He saw pride, avarice, and lust in every corner. He had been sent to Florence to teach at the San Marco Monastery, a place that Lorenzo himself generously supported. From the moment he stepped into the pulpit, his message was stark and uncompromising. His early sermons in Florence were not immediately impactful. His voice was at first described as weak, his delivery somewhat awkward, but as he continued, his passion and the sheer force of his conviction began to captivate audiences. He spoke of the decay of the church, the corruption of its clergy, and the imminent wrath of God. He prophesied a great deluge, a divine sword that would strike Italy, a purification that would sweep away the wicked and cleanse the righteous. These were not abstract theological debates. Savonarola spoke with a fierce urgency, as if he had received direct revelations from God. His denunciations grew sharper. He attacked what he called the tyrants who oppressed Florence, clearly hinting at the Medici family's informal but absolute rule. He railed against the extravagance of the Florentine elite, their fine clothes, their lavish banquets, their obsession with earthly beauty and classical learning. He saw the very artistic and intellectual pursuits that defined the Medici era as dangerous distractions from spiritual truth. He preached that true beauty lay in piety and humility, not in the gilded domes and painted frescoes of Florence. Lorenzo de' Medici, ever astute, initially underestimated this friar. He had managed countless rivalries, contained numerous political threats, and cultivated many artists and scholars. Savonarola was a new kind of challenge, and Lorenzo reportedly sent his associates to check out the new preacher, perhaps hoping to co-opt him or encourage him to moderate his tone. Accounts suggest that Lorenzo sent a delegation, possibly including Poliziano and Pico della Mirandola, to visit Savonarola. These men, accustomed to intellectual discourse and the refined world of the Medici court, found Savonarola unyielding in his convictions. He was not swayed by flattery, gifts, or philosophical debate. Savonarola's popularity grew rapidly. His uncompromising message, delivered with an almost hypnotic intensity, struck a chord with many Florentines, especially the poor and those weary of the city's excesses. They saw in him a true prophet, a voice of moral clarity, in a world that felt increasingly materialistic. Crowds flocked to the Duomo to hear him preach, sometimes arriving before dawn to secure a spot. The sheer number of people attending his sermons became a public demonstration of his growing influence, a silent challenge to Medici authority. This was the quiet beginning of the storm. Lorenzo, with his characteristic subtle grip on power, preferred consensus and control. Savonarola's absolute pronouncements, his divine authority, directly undermined Lorenzo's carefully constructed secular leadership. Lorenzo believed in art, diplomacy, and worldly wisdom. Savonarola preached that such things were vanity, leading to spiritual ruin. The very values that defined Medici Florence were under attack from within, from a simple friar who claimed to speak for God. The city was divided. The seeds of radical change were sown. The seemingly spiritual disagreement held within it the potential for political upheaval, a direct threat to the Medici's long-standing dominance. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown that would decide the fate of Florence.